beyond beyond within his own field, right? So this is a measure of scholarship, is that when your research is adopted beyond your cohort of cronies, maybe. And so for Peter, this would mean, part of this means really educating healthcare professionals who are using basic science to treat and manage diseases of the eye or the health of the eye and vision. So when I was a postdoc at Penn, I actually was a postdoc with Peter's spouse, Sally Zygmunt. And at the time, my sister was studying in Manhattan to be an eye doctor. And she was coming out to visit, and I said something about how Sally and Peter were gonna have us over for drinks. And I said, oh, maybe you know Sally's husband. Maybe you know of Sally's husband, Peter Sterling. He studies the retina. And she said, you know Peter Sterling? You kidding me? She said, we read his papers all the time. And actually it was kind of amusing because when we did go over there for drinks, she couldn't speak. So usually an outgoing person couldn't speak because she was sitting next to Peter Sterling. That's only happened once to her possibly, and never again. So I think Peter's work in vision really has been really important, and so important that it's taught to healthcare providers. But so in more recently, Peter's written this book that I just loved called What is Health? And it's this big broad synthesis written for the general public or a non-science audience, and really links evolution, cell biology, biochemistry, development, neuroscience, and a lot of his ideas that he's thought about over quite a long span of time. Again, real impressive scholarship. But he's written this book and hopefully appealing to a broad audience. And so this summer, I sent this book to a friend of mine who is a non-scientist, and he would describe himself as, he describes himself as a community college dropout. But he's smart, he's witty, he's very creative, but no science training at all. He struggled in the beginning of this book, and I said, just keep going. You are gonna love this book. And so he sent me this text a couple of weeks ago that I shared with Peter. Heading out for some excessive consumption, need to boost my dopamine. Just finished the book, loved it. A real eye-opener about things I never knew existed. And he told me later that this book just blew his mind. Like he was just in awe of this synthesis. And so again, this is another story of Peter's impact beyond his field. And so the ideas in this book are big and broad and really fun. And so it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Peter Sterling.
Thank you, Lynn. I fear that you've set me up to fail, for disappointment. Anyway, I'll try. It's very nice to meet you all, and so we'll see what happens. So now I have to figure out. I share my screen. I hit share screen, and then I hit my PowerPoint. I guess. Is that right? What am I doing? Share my PowerPoint. Yeah. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
You got it.
Okay, and now I select the slideshow and I play from the start. Okay, we're all set. Okay, so my laboratory is as Lynn suggested. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. My laboratory focused on the fine-scale neural circuits in the retina and other places, but leading ultimately to this book with Simon Laughlin. He published this in 2015. And the core point of this book was that the brain, while smarter than a supercomputer, uses 100,000-fold less energy in space. And we discussed that required to manage this, there are 10 principles that the brain uses for efficient design. And of course, since the body uses 80% of the total energy, the body has to be efficient too. But the central concept of physiology, which you all know as biologists is homeostasis, makes no reference at all to efficiency. There's nothing in the idea of homeostasis about efficiency. And so instead, it's supposed to, homeostasis is supposed to maintain constancy by detecting errors and correcting them, like a thermostat. But of course, to be efficient, you must prevent errors. Whoops. So, the brain actually predicts needs and regulates physiology and behavior to meet them. And Joseph Iyer and I, a long time ago, called this allostasis. Instead of constancy maintained by error correction, it's constancy maintained by change. And we've recently updated the story with Jay Shulkin to summarize this for Trends in Neurosciences in 2019. So my new book that Lynn mentioned considers health in a broader context, and it asks, what does our species require for a healthy life? And it asks, can we achieve this with drugs? Moreover, since we're constrained for efficiency, why did our ancestors, upon reaching La Cueva de los Manos in southern Argentina 11,000 years ago, immediately invest in pigments and tools to spray these gorgeous stencils on their cave? In short, why did Homo sapiens' brain invest in art? Now, I'm licensed by my NIH BioSketch to discuss molecules and circuits, but art and evolution, maybe not. So my grasp on these themes emerged from a tension between my laboratory studies and my social activism. And so the book and this talk reflect substantially how I've lived. So I'm going to show you a film clip now. This was my first scientific report. And upon leaving it, upon submitting it, I left Ithaca for Mississippi to join the Freedom Rides. And I was a few days after the late John Lewis. So I'm going to show you this film clip, and it's a brief clip, and I have a speaking role in this. I found it on a PBS series on the Freedom Riders, and so let's just take a look at this clip.
How about you? Can you give me any of your feelings on why you want to take part in this?
Well, I want to help establish the right of all Americans to eat together and to travel together.
Why do you think it's your responsibility?
I think it's every American's responsibility. I only think that some are more conscious of their responsibility than others.
So 30 minutes after this film clip was taken, we landed in Jackson, and 30 minutes later, basically, whoops.
How about?
Yeah, we were processed, and we were in jail. So next, I'm in graduate school in Cleveland, Ohio, at Western Reserve University, and I'm studying the spinal cord, cortical projections of the spinal cord. But I was still I was sneaking away from my microscope to canvas in an area called Central. It was the poorest, densest black ghetto in the center of Cleveland. And when I would knock on the door, people would come to the door with their faces sagging, walking with a cane, slurred speech. And when I went back to the lab, I discovered that this was because they had hemiplegia. And what that involves is destruction of these very pathways to the spinal cord and brainstem that I was studying. And I asked my advisor, what is this from? And he said, well, it's caused basically by a stroke caused by hypertension. And I realized that my grandfather actually had lived before Central was black. It was a Jewish ghetto in the early part of the 20th century. And my grandfather had been segregated there, and he also had hypertension and suffered an early stroke. And so I began to think, well, maybe hypertension is related to social tension. So, I began to think about that. Now, let's fast forward to my own, as I wrote my thesis on this subject, Cleveland burst into an upheaval in that summer, where the police and National Guard came in. It was, really a frightening time. So, fast forward to my own laboratory. I was still slipping away from the lab, but now to the library to study and read more about the social causes of hypertension and the biological mechanisms. And I was also beginning to devour ethnographic studies to learn how other peoples live, really. And soon I was slipping away to visit indigenous communities in Central America. And now my wife and I live half of each year in the mountains, on a farm in the mountains of Western Panama. And these are our neighbors milling our sugarcane. So here is what I've learned, which is combines really my experience, ethnographic experience, and my laboratory studies. So first, blood pressures of people who live by foraging or horticulture, such as this Nobe indigenous family in Panama. This cottage that they live in. Here's the woman waving to us as we walk by. This is 2 days walk from the nearest market. People who live like this, their blood pressures are low, and they're steady with age. They don't rise with age. And this is true for similar peoples in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in South America, and so on. This is, blood pressure is steady. But in the US, blood pressures start to rise as children enter school. This is age down here. This is systolic blood pressure in millimeters of mercury. And this red line marks the level at which you're considered, this is the hypertensive range. And what this shows is that by graduation, 25% of the population already has their blood pressures in the hypertensive range. So this is the reason is this is due to sustained physiological arousal. And the rise is steepest for African Americans. And the reason is pretty clear that in the US, Black lives still don't matter. So I want to show now, this is a recording over 24 hours. This is noon, and this is midnight, and the next day is noon. And this is, upper trace is systolic blood pressure, the lower is diastolic. And this is a recording from a single individual with an indwelling catheter in his arm. And he's walking around recording his pressure. And to me, this was, I found this in the early 70s, and it really amazed me because, we learned that we have, quote, have a blood pressure. It's 110, it's 120. But this shows that your blood pressure is fluctuating continuously with your mental state. And so, for example, at this point here, the subject is in lecture. He's dozing in lecture. His blood pressure goes from 110, 120 down to 80 and so on. And then somebody jabs him with a pin, and the brain predicts with the pin danger, and he wakes up. His pressure rises. He looks around, realizes this is a prank, and he goes back to sleep, basically, and his pressure falls. And then during the rest of the day, there are all these various fluctuations, which are unidentified changes in mental state. But at midnight, we identified that he he became sexually aroused, blood pressure rises. Following sex, it falls, it crashes essentially, and he sleeps. And it goes way, way, way down in this period. And then in the next day, next morning, he's coping with his life, getting his children ready for school and work and so on. And it goes up in a sustained way. So the first point here is this is what we mean by allostasis, that the brain recognizes the context, it predicts the need, and it adjusts the pressure to respond. And what it does is to provide just enough, just in time. No more pressure than you need and no less. What this shows also is a very wide dynamic range, and that this system for regulating pressure is extremely responsive to what's going on. And this is my definition of health, which is the ability of the capacity of the body to respond to variation in demand. Now, for efficiency, systems adapt to predicted demand. So, for example, arteries adapt to the predicted mean pressure. And when the pressure is, say, what would be called normal, mean pressure is around 100 millimeters of mercury, and you have this sort of fluctuation, the arteries can be reasonably thin, basically. And because this is a thickness that they're able to handle this level of variation. But when the brain predicts a need to keep the blood pressure high over long periods, this is it. Here the mean blood pressure is near 160 millimeters of mercury. It still comes down during sleep and so on, but it's way much higher than one would like. And then the arteries actually adapt. They thicken, and they adapt just like the muscle in the arteries. They adapt just like your biceps would to lifting weights. And of course, the lumen becomes partly occluded by muscle, and so you need extra pressure just to force the blood through this thickened, partially occluded vessel. So, in this sense, the high blood pressure becomes addictive. You need the high pressure just to get normal flow. So the brain controls all the mechanisms that regulate blood pressure. And this is something that I had to work out in the 70s by just reading lots of papers and basically studying the physiology as it was understood then. So first thing is that the brain has nerves that go to the kidney and go to endocrine glands in the kidney, cells in the kidney. And this controls either retains salt water in the vascular system or spills it. And so that helps control plasma volume. The brain also controls the heart rate and contractility, and the two of these together determine the cardiac output. The brain also controls, by nerves to all the blood vessels, it controls the arterial resistance. And these three factors determine the pressure. So it also controls your appetite for salt. We are told by doctors that we shouldn't eat so much salt. Americans eat too much salt. But in fact, the brain decides how much salt you will eat in order to support the level of pressure that the brain is setting. So, this was understood by a guy named J.P. Henry, who was studying blood pressure, social aspects of blood pressure experimentally in mice. And he concluded after many years of experiment, he says this: psychosocial arousal induces salt appetite, making a society's salt consumption a measure of its social stress. Excuse me. So now the question is, how is this treated? Well, uh, we have drugs to block each of these mechanisms, but each time you block one of the mechanisms, the brain compensates. So for example, a treatment for hypertension, drug treatment, very often begins with a diuretic, and that causes the kidney to spill salt water. But the brain recognizes that, and it increases the heart rate. And so we have a drug to control that. That's a beta blocker, and that prevents the heart from increasing its rate and strength of contraction. And so, well, we're making some progress, but of course the brain's, if it wants to raise pressure, it can constrict the arterial vessels and increase resistance. And there are drugs to block that too, among them a calcium channel blocker. So in the end, and this doesn't exhaust, there are many other kinds of drugs to affect other salt handling and so on. And the result is that we can eventually take control over the body's mechanisms for controlling pressure. But the problem is, if you control the pressure and hold it steady, people can't vary their exercise capacity. You can't respond to new predictions. The other problem is, and I, both in Amherst, Massachusetts, where I am now, and in Panama when I'm there, I walk on a regular basis with men my age, and a fair number of them are on beta blockers for one reason or another. And when we come to a hill, they have to slow down. I have to slow down to continue the walk with them. And so this is an issue. Once you take control of the system, you prevent it from responding. It's an issue. So the other issue is that each of these drugs acts in multiple ways. You're all biologists. You know that beta adrenergic receptors are all over the body. So when you give a beta blocker, you affect many points. And for example, if you give a beta blocker to control heart rate, you also end up increasing blood glucose, and that exacerbates diabetes, which is often an accompaniment of hypertension anyway. So you may treat the hypertension, but you're making diabetes worse. And of course, there are drugs to treat that and to treat the diabetes, and those require more drugs. And we're off on this polypharmacy. So what you end up with is basically a sick patient who is stabilized just precariously by polypharmacy. So I'd like to switch now. There are many examples of this. We could talk for days. There are more in the book. But I'd like now to switch to consider some problems of US health. And I would like to consider how these connect to aspects of our neural design. And finally, just consider a little bit about what we need to do. So first point is that this is age-adjusted mortality rate for people who are now about 50, on the order of 50 years old, middle-aged people. And what this shows, this is deaths per 100,000, and whoops, the death rates in Europe and in Canada and Australia have all been coming down steadily since 1990. And the US was on track for a while, but around 1995, its US rates for middle-aged people started to go up, and they rise. This is sort of a shocking graph, I think. This is from the work of Case and Dayton. And the rises, they point out that the rises are steepest for causes which they call deaths of despair. And that those causes are drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And this graph is for men and women who are about between age 50 and 54. And this is a stunning rise compared to Europe and Australia. So this is for people who were born around 1970. And the thing is, it's fourfold worse for males, US males with no education beyond high school. And that includes 60% of white males. The other point that Case and Dayton make is that this is a cohort born around 1970. And you can see that here are deaths of despair on the x-axis, deaths per 100,000 on the right. And this is the cohort born at 1970. They cross this 100 deaths per 100,000 at around age 45. But those people born 10 years later in 1980, who are now about 40, they cross this same line around age 35. So, and of course, this is my cohort down here, and we're doing fairly well because we had jobs. We weren't that stressed out. Our cohort was small, and it just got progressively worse. You can see decade by decade. And so the people who were born in 1990 are, they're in deep trouble. So, so beyond this, deaths of despair, there is a tremendous rise in obesity. And this is coming from what I call foods of despair, which are rich, greasy, fatty, sweet foods. And at the same time, and of course, from lack of exercise, they go together. So the other thing we have is a rise in this period from what I call murders of despair. These are mass shootings that, and this is a sort of a rising despair that gun control is not going to cure. Of course, you can control the guns, but this isn't going to change the despair that people, particularly in these younger age groups, are experiencing. So the question is, what causes our collective despair? And I want to consider two features of neural design. First, we evolved this tremendous brain. The human brain is 3.5 times that of the chimpanzee, which is our nearest surviving relative. We took care of the other ones. So a chimpanzee, to give an example, forages for food over about 6 kilometers squared. A human's covers 12,000 kilometers squared. There's a huge difference in the development of our brains and our capacity to forage between chimpanzees and humans. So here, this is age, this is net production of calories per day, and this is the chimpanzee, and what you see is that it's born pretty helpless, but by age 5, it's actually feeding itself, taking care of all its own calories, and by age 15, it's reached its maximum capacity for finding food. The humans have this tremendously long period in which they are just soaking up calories, have to be fed, and by parents or the community. And by about age 15, they're just beginning to do something. And during this period of teenagers, they're getting better and better. But if any of you there are parents of teenagers, you should have low expectations, because it really takes humans to be a long time before they reach self-sufficiency around age 20. Beyond that, human productivity increases and increases and increases and increases to peak around age 45. And this is, by the way, in modern studies of brain imaging, the human areas of temporal and frontal lobe really don't complete their maturation of their white matter until the late 40s. We're still growing until that period. And when I've used to talk about this, people say, well, why is that? We didn't live that long, right? But in fact, human foragers did live that long, and they needed that long to reach their maximum productivity, because hunting and gathering is a really hard job. It requires a great deal of understanding and knowledge. So, and of course, they continue. There's some decline beyond around age 45, but beyond age 60, human foragers are still feeding themselves and still producing material for the community. So what this means is that for 200,000 years since the origin of our species, hunting and gathering were these challenging careers that demanded prolonged study and practice and lent meaning to our lives. So let me just see. Yeah, so there's another design issue, and it's this. The brain obeys the principle specialize, because that conserves energy and space. And so this is an example of a human brain. Is the cerebral cortex is divided up into 200 separate areas, because it's an efficient way to do things. But once, yeah, so we have these 200 specialized circuits, and then we've reached the limit in our skull. Our skull is full, and so we couldn't be individually any smarter, but we could be smarter as a community by specializing across brains. And so we all have these 200 areas, but they're not the same. And some people have areas well developed for music, others for art, others for hunting, others for all kinds of activities. And so we each get this special bundle and have some set of innate abilities. And of course, we practice our innate abilities because that's what's most rewarding. I took the trombone. I studied the trombone when I was in school, but I never practiced it because I really couldn't do it very well. But it wasn't satisfying. Whereas some of my classmates who were musical, just took off. So what this ends up doing is it produces a community of experts: a hunter, a healer, a musician, a storyteller, and so on. And so this communal intelligence outcompetes a design where everybody in the community had the exact same brain and knew the same stuff and was good at the same stuff. So it's obvious that this is a really good design, but so it makes us awesome as a species, but there are costs to this design. And one is mental distress, individual mental distress, because we are so strange from each other. And another is interpersonal conflict, partly for the same reasons, that we are so strange to each other. And so, but to benefit from these communal intelligence, we must cohere in some way. And this is achieved by what I've called sacred practice, and that is what words alone cannot express. Excuse me, the hazard of, yeah. So what happened was that the brain, in order to allow us to capture the benefits of communal intelligence, invested in these costly circuits that went well beyond foraging, and these included art. And so we find evidence of art going back really, really far. This is one example, spectacular example from Indonesia from 44,000 years ago. In Africa, southern tip of Africa, there are artistic artifacts from 100,000 years. And we had music. Here's a bone flute from a cave in Germany of 40,000 years ago. So, and of course, these artifacts were preserved, but naturally what weren't preserved, but I think we can assume that we had also, was dance, storytelling, singing, and sex. I think sex is part of this can be part of this human sacred practice. And what these do is to elicit, all of them, emotions of awe, grief, joy, laughter, and so on, that help release tensions and allow us to cooperate. So what happened? One consequence of communal intelligence was the steam engine, which was finally, I wouldn't say perfected, but developed to a very effective degree around 1769 by James Watt is given credit, but there was really a whole host of engineers and developments, and we had to have Boyle's law and Charles' law, and there was a whole scientific background for it. But it led very quickly to an exponential rise in industry and industrial growth. And this is 1769, and this is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And you can see that this took off in an exponential way. It's rising like an action potential, but an action potential has mechanisms to bring it to a conclusion and to turn it around for repolarization. And we are not even close to turning this around right now, except for this virus. So one of the people who was right in the thick of this period was Adam Smith, the economist who was sort of thought of as the father of economics. And he realized there was going to be a problem right away. And here's what he said in 1776. He says, "The man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding, exercise his invention, and he naturally loses the habit of exertion and of this exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become." This is quite an amazing projection of what was about to happen. I think, I don't agree that we become stupid. I don't think that's the point. That's not the problem. It's not that we're stupid. It's that we're still smart, but we've narrowed the possibilities to exercise our gifts. And so we evolved clearly to explore the planet. We cover the whole place. But now multitudes of us are just consigned to punching a ticket or scanning a barcode. And what this means is that jobs learned in minutes or days are just not a sufficient challenge to keep us from despair. So it's this mismatch between our abilities and our chances to exercise them that causes the despair. So what links despair to this compulsive consumption of food and drugs and so on? We inherited from worms, from the first worms, the bilateral animals, we inherited a circuit, a neural circuit for seeking that drives us to go out and look for food, look for comfort, look for sex, and so on. And the way this was set up was that the circuit rewards each unpredicted find with a pulse of dopamine. It's a neural transmitter. And here's an example. This is a recording from a single neuron. Each dot here is a spike. In each row, this is time in this direction, and each row is a response to an unpredicted reward. And this region here, this is a histogram summing all these responses. And what it shows is that every time the animal in this recording, it's a monkey, receives a reward that it was unexpected, he gets a pulse of these extra spikes and a pulse of dopamine. And the pulse of dopamine we experience as a pulse of satisfaction, of relief. We can stop seeking for a brief time. But of course, the pulses dissipate, and this is part of the design because we need to go on seeking the next. If we get a drop of food, we then have to go look for water. If we get water, we have to look for warmth, and so on. So we're set up this way. And the thing is that foragers find food unpredictably. They're out looking for something. They find a rabbit or a root, and they get a pulse of dopamine. They're looking for comfort. They find a dry cave, a warm fire. They get a pulse of dopamine. So they get
frequent small pulses, and that keeps them from being keeps them comfortable, basically. We now find food and comfort predictably without any effort or surprise. And of course, this is convenient. We're accustomed to this. But the problem is that when a reward is predicted, it doesn't produce dopamine. So this is the same neuron here where the rewards were predicted, expected. And what you can see is there's very little extra dopamine from a predicted reward. So, so this gives us relatively few pulses from this sort of searching, and we grow restless and anxious because this is part of our design. We need to search until we can get this. So, so what to do? Well, we're now treating a despairing population of obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and all kinds of addictions. We're treating everybody at this molecular level. Yeah. So, but I think the problem is that, I just want to see what, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I want to go back. I didn't quite finish here. I want to make the point that when food is predicted, the main unpredicted component is more food and more and richer. And when you get a large serving of rich food, you get a surge of dopamine. And of course, when the first surprise is more, the next surprise has to be still more. And we go from a Mac to a Big Mac to a Whopper to get our satisfaction. And so, of course, the brain, by design, adapts to all these surges of dopamine by reducing its sensitivity, and then we have to have way more. And the problem is the same for all drugs: alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines, and opioids all evoke these great surges of dopamine to which we then adapt. So now, what to do? We now treat this despairing population, which has all these diseases, at the molecular level. And yet, polypharmacy, as I've tried to indicate, is not a plausible route to health. And moreover, it's very expensive. And so if we could find a way to live without polypharmacy, we wouldn't be arguing about the cost of medical care. It would just be not a problem. So what does health in the end require? One thing it requires very clearly is social inclusion. Everybody has to feel like their lives actually matter. And this, by reducing inequality, we reduce stress and despair, and we improve health. And this is a very good book by a bunch of several economists about the health consequences of inequality. Second, health requires practicing our gifts across the lifespan. Automation is progressively reducing the quality of jobs as well as their number, but it's not just that we don't need more jobs. That isn't the point. We need challenging activities that do honor to our large intelligence. The third is that health requires expanding sacred practice to relieve the sorts of tensions that are caused by our innate mutual strangeness. We now click for products of sacred practice for Spotify, Netflix, ESPN, Pornhub, and so on. But vicarious experience that we get by clicking simply cannot substitute for participation. So in conclusion, okay, health is responsiveness. That's adaptation to continual change. It involves predicting likely future needs and minimizes errors, and therefore it's efficient. Allostasis includes all of these processes that support predictive change. And it started with cyanobacteria with a clock that could predict the best time to manufacture DNA, which was at night when there was not so much UV light to destroy it. The worm brain predicts the needs of each organ and learns to find the resources. And so human metabolic signaling, metabolism and signaling was optimized 500 million years ago. And now we are tweaking them to fix problems over the last 200 years. It doesn't make sense because drugs that block these mechanisms reduce responsiveness. So our brains evolved finally for individual lives of physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual responsiveness, learning across the whole lifespan. And I think it's our responsibility to live these lives and to help others live them. Thank you. Okay, so now stop share. Yeah, okay. Okay.
So I think Aaron was going to try to monitor questions or comments through the chat box, or we can just have a free-for-all.
I'm up for a free-for-all. I mean,
Okay. So I don't play these silly games on my phone, but I know lots of people do play these silly games. Are you thinking of those as kind of a dopamine reward system, these silly Candy Crush things, or even Tetris? Is this why they're so appealing to people who aren't me?
Sure.
Now my weirdness is okay.
Yeah, I mean, some people like those, and yeah, they get a little unexpected excitement. Sure, yeah, that's a pretty harmless activity to give you some relief. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so kind of adding on to that previous question. So what would be your opinion of using like augmented reality, like virtual reality type stuff to kind of supplement this kind of thing that we're missing?
Well, I think virtual reality is another example of, I mean, it's quite interesting, but it's another example of essentially vicarious experience. And, I think any of these things are fine for a while. I mean, I like to watch a film. I like to, listen to a concert and so on, but they're not the same as actually being personally engaged with other people in doing activities. And so I think there's nothing wrong with them, and there's nothing wrong with looking at your screen and doing your emails and so on. But in the long run, it's not going to save us from despair, and particularly for the people who don't. I mean, look, most of you who are attending this my talk are highly educated. You all have work that engages you in the way that hunter-gatherers were engaged. And so, you tend to be healthy, you tend to be get exercise, you tend to not be addicted to things, because, if you're really addicted to drugs, you really can't do the stuff that you want to do. So you take care of yourself. So, I think it's fine to play with virtual reality, but I don't think it's going to save the world.
What are your thoughts on the pandemic? Because we're social creatures and we are now trapped. We're alone. The suicide rate is going up for the younger population. So what do you think?
What do I think about what?
You think we'll pull out of this okay? Or do you think this kind of isolation is going to have some permanent damage on us?
Well, it's certainly going to have long-term consequences, as did the 1918 pandemic. Sure, I mean, it's going to increase despair for a while. It's going to, and I think particularly the divisiveness in the country, the lack of clarity about how to proceed, I think the thing that concerns me most personally is, we'll get beyond this, but meanwhile, the clock is ticking on the environment, and that, that is really going to be very hard to reverse, and every minute counts. And in a way, the pandemic has done us a favor of reducing, some travel and reducing air greenhouse gases from airlines and stuff like that. But we haven't got a minute to lose. That is really a critical thing.
Your talk was fabulous, by the way. Just want to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we have Donald.
Yeah, hi. I had two general questions, well, one general question and like a more specific one. So firstly, would this presentation be available after the lecture so we could review it in our own time and like look at the figures, perhaps, more detail?
So for one thing, I think your Erin was recording it, and it's fine with me to use it. I'd also say that my my email has, which Lynn and Erin have, has a video of a talk. It's the same talk I gave at Berkeley, basically, in February, when one can still do that. And so that's available as well. Sure.
Okay, thank you. And another question that I have, I read a book recently, and it was by James Nestor, and it was about the subject of like proper breathing techniques. And I was wondering whether you had heard about that in your, I guess, concept of allostasis and how our breathing has changed since the Industrial Revolution.
Breathing, not breeding, breathing.
Breathing, sorry, breathing.
No, I don't know about it. I do know that people who are concerned with meditation and stuff like that to calm ourselves are concerned with breathing. That's part of it. So I can believe that that's significant. Sure.
I would just be interested on your take on it as all, and how you would integrate it with your ideas.
Well, not knowing about it, if it's improving people's mood and calming them, I'm for it.
All right, cool.
Dr. Meyer.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. You touched on this a little bit just now, but I have a number of colleagues who are very interested in this concept or perspective of One Health, which is that human health is interrelated with the health of the environment and other animals and organisms living on the planet. And while I know that human health is sort of at the center of your work, I was curious about your perspective as to how that interrelated with what you just talked about, which was environmental health, and then also other organismal health. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. I mean, I'm very deeply concerned about this. In Panama, we live on a farm. We've been there for 15 years, and I watched the gradual disappearance of the insects on the farm. As the insects, I mean, the variety of insects has really dramatically fallen. And the reason is pretty clear, because my wife and I walk through the neighborhood. It's a community of small farmers, and they use insecticides and herbicides just in vast quantities. And I have a certain sympathy, because we try to grow stuff on our farm, and the insects take a lot, and do a lot of damage. But the use of pesticides there is so terrible for the rest of the life. And the people who are doing it, they just want to make their livelihood, but they're not able to really think about the terrible changes that they're making in our community. And of course, once you lose the insects, you lose the birds, and so on. So it's a very serious problem that we face all the time, and the herbicides as well. Even we're living in the Connecticut River Valley here. It's a big farming area, and I noticed in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago, a reporter said, well, so-and-so, this is a family farm. They harvested 10 million tons of potatoes this year, and pounds of potatoes, I guess. And it's great. They grow the potatoes, and then they spray them with this stuff to kill the vines, and then harden off the potato skins, and then they dig them up. And of course, I wrote a letter to the newspaper saying, this reporter should have asked these people what it is they're spraying to kill the vines. Well, what they're spraying are herbicides, and like paraquat and I don't forget, there's some other kind of quat. And basically, we're all eating these potatoes that have been sprayed with herbicide just before the harvest. Besides their own chemistry, these herbicides are persistent in the soil and they're killing soil organisms. And so not only we're warming the planet, but our agriculture is just doing tremendous, tremendous damage. Which concerns me, as you can tell. So.
Okay.
I want to recommend Peter's book again. I have it here at home if anyone would like to borrow it. There's the first couple chapters that are on really cell biology and biochemistry and just some simple things like thermal motion. The best things in life are free. If anyone else would like to borrow it, more than welcome. Of course, you're going to have to come over to get it, but or coordinate a meeting time and place. I had my writing student this year, my undergrad writing student this semester, read the first couple chapters, just really to think about these chemistry principles or what you learn in the intro courses and how they play out on a larger scale, and also to read good writing.
Thank you, Lynn, once again. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I also have, by the way, I could offer you if you're interested, I have a PowerPoint on writing that I gave recently to UMass graduate students, and it's titled Writing the Joke. And it's about basically a scientific paper is like telling a joke. And all the things a comedian wouldn't do, like he wouldn't say, I have a really novel joke for you. And many recent jokes have been told, but they aren't that funny. And now I have a really new funny one. And so I go through this and I say, you have to ask, what would Seinfeld do? But of course, these students don't know who Seinfeld is. So I'm up against the problem of two generations separated from my cultural references. So, but I'll send it.
Thank you.
Well, I wish you all a good semester dealing with the COVID. We're all suffering. I think probably especially the students. My granddaughter's a senior in high school in Medford and is trying to get her act together and figure out what to do. It's a very hard time. So vote.
Matthias, were you going to
Peter,
say?
would you, it's Matthias for, well.
I missed that. What?
You froze. He froze.
Oh, he froze.
I think he's frozen.
Decide.
He's not unfreezing very well.
Close my video a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We could.
Maybe turn off the video and then the sound will have more bandwidth.
Okay. Don't know if you can hear me or not. Seem to be issues. Forget it. Too complicated.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, you can? Okay,
yeah.
so I was just wondering, Peter. So as a scientist from UPenn, you said you spent now half a year in Panama growing sugarcane. What brought you to do this?
Well, as I said, I began slipping away from my lab to just how people live in Central America. And Central America is a place where you can easily visit. You don't have to go all the way up the Amazon. You can visit indigenous peoples just by walking a few hours out of town, basically. So for example, last year, so the people who live on our farm are indigenous Nobe Indians, and they come from a big sort of reserve up in the mountains, about 2 hours drive from us. And last year I accompanied the whole family to take their oldest son, who's a teacher at a high school. That's it's 9 hours walk from the nearest road. And so when I heard they were going to take him up there to teach, I thought, I would like to do that. and they said, well, we're going, a couple of days. I said, no, I need a couple of weeks to get in shape to do that. So I trained for about 2 weeks, and despite my wife's dubiousness about the wisdom of this, I managed to do it. And but you meet along a trail. Once you leave the road, you meet along the trail people who are traveling here and there. They're going to communal gatherings, a 2 days walk away. And so that appealed to me and to my wife, combined with birding and, wildlife. But people ask us whether we make money on our farm. We grow some sugarcane, but mainly we grow navel oranges and avocados and limes and stuff. Do we make money on our farm? No, of course not. We lose a great deal of money, but I consider it as our basically tuition for long-term studies in anthropology and in ethnography, and we get a lot out of living with these people and seeing how they manage very interesting lives.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I'm a cell biologist like Lynn, so I learned definitely a lot also.
Great. Well, I think there's stuff of interest in the book about I learned a lot about cell biology, trying to work out the first couple of chapters. So anyway, thank you all very much. Nice to meet you all. I wish we could have done it in person. So thank you.
Before everyone goes, I just want to say that so Peter had not wanted me to discuss his civil rights activities ahead of time, and he wanted to have that as his own punchline. I shared with a few people a larger clip of that PBS special on the Freedom Rides. It's like right at the max of what I can send through Lehigh email. So if anyone else would like the clip, I'm happy to send it, and Peter, I'll send it to you too as well. I showed this in Core 1 when I taught it, as we were encouraged, used to be encouraged to, in any class, to incorporate something for Martin Luther King Day. And so this was what I showed to 300 freshmen once upon a time, kind of encouraging them. I was really moved by that quote that he showed his young self saying that, everyone's responsibility. It went over like a thud, with a thud to freshmen, but to you, perhaps, it'd be much more enjoyable to see a longer sequence. So if you'd like it, just email me.
I've never said afterwards anything so concisely.
All right. Well, so thank you all for coming, and happy weekend.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful.
Give Sally my
Thank you
best.
very much.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. I'm hanging out till the end.
Right?
Yeah.
Who's the last one?
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen, very much. Yeah. It was
Take care. Be
so
well.
that went okay, Lynn, right?
Oh yeah, it went great. It's still recording, so we'll say it went great. No.
I'll stop that.
It was great. It was great.